The fluorescent light above gate 14 buzzed like a trapped insect, and nobody looked up. Nobody ever looks up in airports. People move through those spaces like water through pipes, contained, purposeful, unseeing. But Miriam was looking up. Miriam was always looking at things other people chose not to see. She stood with her cleaning cart at the edge of the corridor, her grey uniform pressed into a crisp fold at the collar, her silver-streaked hair pulled back the way her grandmother had always insisted. Neat, baby, always neat, even when the world is not neat back to you. She was 44 years old. She had been cleaning this airport for 11 years. She knew every crack in every tile between Terminal B and Terminal D. She knew which bathroom near Gate 22 flooded whenever it rained hard. She knew the name of every janitor, every security guard, every woman selling overpriced sandwiches at the kiosk by Gate 9. She was invisible to the passengers and deeply known to everyone else. That is a specific kind of life. Most people never think about it. She was refilling the paper towel dispenser in the women's restroom near Gate 14 when she heard the heels. Sharp, expensive, the kind of heels that announce themselves before their owner arrives. And then the voice. I, carrying, unconcerned with who might hear. I don't understand why airports don't just have separate bathrooms for first class. It's absolutely unreasonable. I have to share a restroom with... look at this. Miriam did not turn around. She kept her hands moving, pressing the folded paper into the dispenser, smooth and even. There were two of them. She could see them in the mirror above the sinks without turning. Two women, mid-40s, dressed in the particular way of people who have never had to think about what things cost. The taller one had dark hair and wore a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Miriam's monthly rent. The other was blonde, carrying a bag that Miriam recognized, not because she owned things like that, but because her grandmother used to clean a house where a woman owned several of them. Her grandmother had dusted those bags with a soft cloth every Tuesday morning. Honestly, Patricia, the blonde one said, setting her bag on the counter right next to the spot Miriam had just cleaned. You need to just breathe. The flight to Geneva is only 8 hours. Patricia, the tall one, looked at Miriam in the mirror. Not the way you look at a person, the way you look at furniture. Excuse me, Patricia said, and her voice had the texture of something worn smooth by years of getting what it wanted. Can you come back and do this later? We'd like some privacy. Miriam looked up from her cart. She met Patricia's eyes in the mirror, calm and even. I just need 2 more minutes to finish restocking, she said. I'll be out of your way. Patricia made a sound in her throat that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. 2 minutes. Of course. She turned back to the mirror and began reapplying her lipstick with the focused attention of someone who has decided a thing is beneath response. Miriam finished the paper towels. She collected her supplies. She pushed her cart toward the door with the unhurried movement of someone who has long since learned that hurrying for other people's comfort is one of the things you choose or don't choose when you finally understand who you are. She did not rush. She never rushed. And she was almost to the door when Patricia said it in that particular low tone people use when they want to be overheard but maintain plausible deniability. Some people just never manage to do better, do they? And her friend laughed, not cruelly, just easily. The way people laugh when something confirms what they already believed. Miriam pushed her cart through the door and out into the corridor. The fluorescent light buzzed above her. Passengers moved around her like water around a stone. She stood for one moment with both hands on the handle of the cart, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her grandmother had taught her. When someone shows you how small their world is, her grandmother used to say, you don't have to move into it. But what no one there in that airport corridor knew, not the passengers rushing past, not the blonde woman in the bathroom, not Patricia with her cream blazer and her Geneva flight, was that Miriam had a meeting in 4 days. A meeting that would change the shape of her life so completely that she sometimes, in the months that followed, could barely remember who she had been before it. And the person who had arranged that meeting was someone Patricia would have recognized immediately. Someone whose name Patricia would have spoken with a very different tone of voice. This story did not start in that airport bathroom. It started 40 years ago, in a small yellow house on the edge of a town that most maps don't bother to mark, with a woman named Rose who smelled like talcum powder and gardenia soap, and a man named Earl who whistled while he worked, and a little girl named Miriam who arrived on their doorstep on a Tuesday afternoon in October with 2 garbage bags full of her belongings and eyes that had already learned not to expect too much. She was 4 years old. Her parents were alive. They were healthy. They were, in fact, at that very moment, boarding a flight to a city where new opportunities awaited them. Her father had been offered a position at a financial firm in Boston. Her mother had ambitions of her own. They were young and bright and full of forward momentum, and Miriam, small, quiet Miriam, who cried at night and was slow to settle into new places and needed more patience than they felt they could currently offer, Miriam was, in the language her parents used when they discussed her with each other, not the right fit for this chapter of our lives. Rose and Earl were her father's parents. They had a small house and a big garden and a fixed income, and more love than they knew what to do with. They said yes without hesitation. Miriam grew up calling them Grandma Rose and Grandpa Earl. But the truth is that they were, in every way that mattered, her mother and her father. It was Rose who taught her to braid her hair, and Earl who taught her to ride a bike in the flat stretch of road beside the house. It was Rose who sat with her when she was sick, and Earl who drove her to school on winter mornings when the bus was unreliable. It was the two of them who attended every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every awkward spring concert where Miriam played the recorder with more enthusiasm than skill. Her parents, her biological parents, Thomas and Vivian, visited twice a year, Christmas and summer. They brought gifts that were always slightly wrong, as if purchased by someone who had been given a description of a child but had never actually met her. Dolls when Miriam preferred books, craft kits when Miriam had no patience for crafts, clothes that were a size too small or a size too large, never quite right. They were not unkind, they were not cruel. They were distant in the specific way of people who have convinced themselves that a choice was correct and therefore do not allow themselves to feel the weight of it. Thomas was polished and professional. Vivian was elegant and self-possessed. When they sat in Rose and Earl's small kitchen, they seemed to occupy a different atmosphere, as if they were visitors from another country where the customs were different and the emotional temperatures ran cooler. Miriam remembered being 7 years old and sitting at the kitchen table while her father talked to Earl about investments. Earl, who had retired from 30 years driving a bus and whose financial planning consisted of a savings account and a prayer. And her mother touched the curtains in the kitchen window with 2 fingers, a small gesture that Miriam, even at 7, understood perfectly. The curtains were not what Vivian would have chosen. Nothing in the house was what Vivian would have chosen, and the child sitting at the table was not what Vivian would have chosen either, not for this chapter. She remembered asking, at 9 years old, during one Christmas visit, if she could come and live with them now. She had asked it carefully, having thought about it for months, having rehearsed the words in the dark of her bedroom until they felt as smooth as stones. Vivian had gone very still. Thomas had cleared his throat. And then Thomas had said, in a voice that was kind and measured and absolute, "Miriam, you have a wonderful home here with Grandma Rose and Grandpa Earl. You're so lucky. Not every child has grandparents who love them so much." He had not answered the question. Miriam understood, even at 9, that this was the answer. She did not ask again. What she did instead was what children do when they cannot have the thing they need most. She built something else. She built a life inside the yellow house, inside Rose's garden, inside Earl's whistled songs and patient lessons. She read everything she could find. She made friends with a ferocity that sometimes startled people. She was the kind of child who noticed things, the way light moved through the kitchen window in the late afternoon, the sound her grandmother made when she was happy, the exact pitch of Earl's whistle when he was working through a problem. She stored these things carefully, the way you store food for a winter you know is coming, and she was, despite everything, or maybe because of everything, a genuinely joyful child, not the performed happiness of someone pretending everything is fine. Something more earned than that, the joy of someone who has found real treasure in an unexpected place and knows it. Rose used to watch her sometimes when Miriam didn't know she was being watched, and her face would go soft with something that was equal parts love and grief. Because Rose knew. Rose always knew. She knew that her granddaughter was exceptional, and she knew that her son and his wife were missing it entirely, and she knew that one day Miriam would have to reckon with all of it. The abandonment wrapped in practicality, the rejection dressed as opportunity, the love that had been rerouted but not replaced. "You are not what happened to you," Rose told her once, when Miriam was 13 and had come home from a school trip where someone had asked about her parents and she had not known what to say. They were sitting on the back steps, looking at the garden in the early evening light. "You are what you decide to do with what happened to you. And I have a feeling you're going to do something extraordinary." Miriam had leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder and not said anything. What she felt in that moment was too complicated for words. Gratitude and grief all tangled together. The way certain plants grow twisted around each other and cannot be separated without destroying both. Earl died when Miriam was 16. Heart attack, very quick, in the garden on a Sunday afternoon. The garden he loved, which felt, as these things sometimes do, like a mercy. He was buried on a Thursday, and by the following Tuesday, Thomas and Vivian had already begun asking questions about the house. Not questions about Rose, questions about the house, its value, its condition, whether Rose had considered moving somewhere smaller, whether she had thought about assisted living, whether she had reviewed her financial situation recently. Rose was 68 years old. She was sharp and capable and entirely in possession of her faculties. She smiled at her son with an expression Miriam could not fully read at 16, but understood perfectly at 30, at 40, and at 44, the expression of someone who has been disappointed so many times that the disappointment no longer surprises them. It just settles in like weather. "I'll be fine," Rose told them. "I have Miriam." Thomas had looked at his mother and then at his daughter with an expression that managed to convey, in a single glance, that he found this arrangement both insufficient and slightly embarrassing. Miriam had looked back at him and thought, "You have no idea what we are to each other. You have never had any idea." She stayed. Of course she stayed. She worked part-time in the last 2 years of high school, a diner, then a grocery store, then a hotel cleaning rooms on weekends. She gave Rose half of everything she earned and saved the other half with a focus that made her co-workers laugh. "Girl, you work like the money is going to disappear," a woman named Cheryl at the hotel said to her once. And Miriam had smiled and said, "It might," because she had learned early that stable ground could shift, that people who should stay sometimes left, and that the only security worth having was the kind you built yourself. She wanted to go to college. This was the desire that lived deepest in her, the one she mentioned to no one but Rose. She had the grades, she had the hunger, she did not have the money. The plan she had constructed, lying awake in her childhood bedroom in the yellow house, was this: work for 2 years after high school, save what she could, apply for every scholarship she was eligible for, and go. Thomas and Vivienne came for Christmas when Miriam was 18, the December before her senior year ended. They sat in the small living room with its familiar furniture and its familiar smell of talcum powder and rosemary. And Thomas told them about his own success with the comfortable amplitude of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times. He had made partner. They had bought a house in Connecticut. The kids, Miriam's half-siblings Marcus and Sophie, whom she had met exactly twice, were doing wonderfully in their private schools. Miriam sat in Earl's old armchair and listened. She was wearing the sweater Rose had given her for her birthday, a soft green one that Rose had found at a church sale, and washed and folded with the same care she gave everything. Miriam watched her father talk and felt, as she often did when he was present, a kind of scientific curiosity. How did a person convince themselves this was acceptable? What internal negotiation had he performed and continued to perform in order to sit in his parents', his late father's, living room and speak about his Connecticut house without any visible discomfort? Vivienne caught Miriam watching and smiled at her. It was a genuine smile. That was the confusing thing. Vivienne was not a monster, neither was Thomas. They were, in the final analysis, ordinary people who had made a specific choice and then spent 2 decades making peace with it, and they had largely succeeded. It was just that Miriam was the evidence they had made peace with. "So, what are your plans?" Thomas asked her, turning to her with the polite interest of someone asking after a co-worker's vacation. "College," Miriam said. Vivienne tilted her head. "Oh, have you looked into community college? There are really some wonderful programs, very practical." "I'm applying to universities," Miriam said. Thomas nodded slowly, in the way that contains a reservation. "That's ambitious. Good for you. Have you thought about how you'll manage the financial side?" "I'm saving," Miriam said, "and I'm applying for scholarships." "Good idea." He said it the way you say "good idea" to a child who has just described a complicated sandcastle. "Kind and complete." Rose reached over and touched Miriam's hand. That was all. Just that. The scholarships did not come through the way Miriam had hoped. She got a partial one, enough to cover 2 semesters, and then the money ran out and she had to take a leave and work, and the leave became permanent in the way that financial leaves so often do, not through any single decision, but through the steady accumulation of necessity. Rose's health was beginning to decline by then, gently, slowly, but there. Miriam was 22 and working full-time at a hotel and taking a class here and there when she could afford it, and spending her evenings cooking dinner and watching old movies with her grandmother and trying not to feel the weight of the life she had imagined that was not becoming the life she was living. She did not call Thomas. The thought crossed her mind exactly once, and then departed. She knew what he would say, and she knew how he would say it, and she knew that she would feel, after that phone call, smaller and colder than before. She had done enough of that kind of cold. She found the airport job when she was 33. It paid better than the hotel, offered benefits, had a union, and was, within its own logic, a kind of stability she had learned to value. She had been there 11 years by the time Patricia stood in that bathroom and said, "Some people just never manage to do better." 11 years of knowing every tile and every name and every restroom that flooded in the rain. Rose died the winter Miriam was 38. She died in the yellow house, in her own bedroom, in the early morning when the light was just beginning, and Miriam was there. She had been there for all of it. The slow, final months, the hospital visits, the difficult nights, the tender mornings. She held Rose's hand, and she spoke to her, and she played the old music that Rose loved, and she made sure that every single day Rose knew that she was seen and loved and not alone. At the funeral, Thomas wept. She had not expected that. He stood at the grave, and his face did the complicated thing that faces do when grief arrives late, when you realize you did not value something while it was available to you, and the realization comes too late for anything to be done about it. Vivienne stood beside him with her hand on his arm. Marcus and Sophie stood on the other side, adults now, vaguely uncomfortable in a way that suggested they had not known Rose well, and felt the absence of that knowledge only now, here, in this place. Miriam stood a little apart from all of them. She was wearing the coat Rose had helped her pick out 2 Christmases ago. She had her grandmother's composure and her grandmother's straight spine and her grandmother's habit of looking at things directly, and she stood at that grave with a grief so deep and real that it had its own gravity. Afterward, at the Yellow House, Thomas found her in the kitchen. "She loved you very much," he said. And it was true, and meant genuinely, and she received it. "She did," Miriam said, "and I loved her." He nodded. There was something in his face that might have been the beginning of a real conversation, the kind that had never been possible between them. She waited to see if he would find his way to it. He didn't. The moment passed, the way those moments do. The will was read 3 weeks later. Thomas had already spoken to his attorney. He had already, it emerged, spoken to the attorney some time earlier about the house. The Yellow House that had been Earl and Rose's, that Miriam had lived in since she was 4 years old, that she had maintained and cleaned and repaired on her modest income for the last 15 years, that smelled of talcum powder and gardenia soap, and every good thing in her life. Thomas was the only child. The house went to Thomas. He told her himself on the phone, in a voice that was careful and not unkind. He told her he would, of course, give her time to arrange other housing. He told her he understood this was difficult. He told her he wanted to be fair. And then he said the word sell. They were thinking of selling. The market was favorable, and he wanted to be transparent with her about the timeline. Miriam sat on the couch in the Yellow House where Rose had held her at 4 years old, and she listened to her father's careful voice, and she did not cry. Not yet. She saved that for later, alone in Rose's bedroom with the door closed and the old music playing, all those songs Rose had loved, and she cried for a long time, for the house and for Rose and for Earl, and for the 9-year-old who had asked a question and been given a non-answer, and for every version of herself that had deserved more than she was given. And then she stopped. She washed her face. She made tea. She had 4 months. She had saved money her entire life with the discipline of someone who has learned never to assume the floor is solid. She had not lived extravagantly. She had not bought the things Patricia and her friend bought without thinking. She had put a small amount away every month for 11 years, and before that, small amounts from smaller paychecks. She had also, over the years of caring for Rose, taken over the management of the household bills, the accounts, the small portfolio of savings Rose had maintained, and she had done it with the same attention she gave to everything, because Rose had asked her to, and because it was necessary, and because Miriam, it turned out, had an uncommon instinct for numbers. It was the airport that had opened the first door. 6 years ago, a manager named Dennis had noticed that Miriam had reorganized the supply storage system for her section in a way that reduced waste by 30%, and he had asked her how she'd done it. She had explained it to him, simply and clearly, the logic of it, the small adjustments, the tracking system she had started keeping in a notebook. Dennis had looked at her for a moment with an expression that was unusual in Miriam's experience. The expression of someone reassessing. He had offered her a shift supervisor position. She had taken it. A year after that, she had completed an online certification in operations management, staying up late to work through the modules after her shifts. 2 years after that, she had completed another one, in supply chain fundamentals. She had not told many people. She did not have a habit of announcing her progress. She had her grandmother's instinct for silence on the things that mattered most. there was one other person who knew. Her name was Delia, and she had been Miriam's closest friend since the early airport years. A large, decisive woman who worked in cargo operations and had the kind of laugh that stopped conversations in crowded rooms. Delia knew everything. She was the person Miriam had called after her father's phone call about the house, and Delia had come over that same evening with food and a bottle of wine and her own particular brand of fierce, practical love. "Okay," Delia had said, sitting across from Miriam at the kitchen table, "walk me through your actual numbers, not your fears, your numbers." They had sat there until midnight, and when Delia finally left, she had hugged Miriam at the door and said, "You are more ready than you know. You just haven't had the reason yet." Now, if you have been with Miriam this far, if you have felt the weight of that yellow house and what it meant, if you have sat with her at that table going through numbers at midnight, then you understand why what comes next matters so much. Like that button, because this story is far from over, and what comes next is the part that will make you want to call someone you love. The meeting Miriam had in 4 days, the one that no one in that airport corridor knew about, had come through a chain of connections so improbable that she had almost dismissed the initial email as a mistake. The man's name was Gerald Park. He was the founder of a logistics consulting firm that contracted with airports and cargo facilities across the country. He had been referred to Miriam through Dennis, who had stayed in her corner through 3 promotions and a department restructuring, and had, apparently, been speaking about her to people in the industry for years. "I've had your name in a file for 18 months, Gerald had told her on the first call, with the directness of someone who values time. "I heard about your operations work in Terminal B. I heard about the certification. I did some research. I'd like to meet in person." She had dressed carefully for that meeting. She wore the good blazer she had bought on clearance 3 years ago, the dark navy one that fit her well and made her feel the way her grandmother's words had always made her feel: grounded, upright, real. She wore her grandmother's small pearl earrings. She carried the notebook she had kept for 6 years, the one with the tracking systems and the efficiency notes and the process observations that she had recorded, not because she expected anyone to ever see them, but because it was how her mind worked, and she had learned to trust that. Gerald Park was a compact man in his 50s, with careful eyes and an easy manner. He had an office in the airport business district, and he had offered her coffee, and he had looked at her notebook for 12 minutes without saying anything. And then he had looked up and said, "How long have you been doing this?" "Keeping records. Thinking this way." She had thought about it. "Since I was about 8, she said. "I grew up with my grandparents. My grandfather drove buses. I used to ride with him sometimes on weekends when they'd let me. I started thinking about routes when I was a kid. What was efficient, what wasn't. It was a game." Gerald Park had nodded slowly. "The role I have in mind," he said, "is Director of Operations for our Eastern Regional Division. It's a significant step from where you are." "I know," she said. "I also know where you are," he said. "And I know what that probably looked like from the outside, to a lot of people who didn't look closely." She met his eyes. "Yes, I look closely," he said. "It's my job and my preference. I'm going to be honest with you about the position, the salary, the challenges, and what I expect. And then I'd like you to ask me every question you have, because I find that the quality of questions tells me more than the answers." She had asked him 11 questions. He had answered every one of them fully. When she left that meeting, walking back through the terminal to collect her cart for her shift, she was still on her shift. She had taken the meeting on her lunch hour. She passed gate 14 and the buzzing fluorescent light, and she thought about Patricia in the cream blazer, saying some people just never manage to do better. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more significant than triumph. She felt the specific sensation of a thing that has been growing in the dark, finally finding light. She called Delia from the parking structure at the end of her shift, sitting in her car with the engine off in the November cold, and she said, "I think it's real." And Delia, without any other context, said, "Of course it is. Now tell me everything." She accepted the position 11 days later. The salary was more than double what she made. The work was exactly what she had been training herself for, in notebooks and online courses and years of careful attention, without knowing precisely what she was training for or if it would ever matter. It mattered. She moved out of the yellow house on a grey February morning. She had found an apartment that was smaller but her own, that smelled of fresh paint and possibility rather than memory, and she had taken only the things that were most essentially hers: her books, her notebooks, her grandmother's kitchen things, the photograph that sat on Rose's dresser for as long as Miriam could remember, Rose and Earl young and laughing on the steps of the yellow house, before the house was old, before everything was old, before any of it happened. She put that photograph on her own dresser in the new apartment, and she stood and looked at it for a long moment, and she said quietly to the two people in it who had given her everything that mattered, "I'm okay. I'm going to be okay." She had been in the new role for 3 weeks when Thomas called. She had not told him about the job. She had not told him about any of it. He called on a Sunday morning, and his voice had the slightly elevated quality of someone who has prepared what they want to say. "Miriam, I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to ask how you're settling in, and also, Vivian and I are going to be in the city next month. We thought it might be nice to get together. Marcus and Sophie will be there as well. A kind of family dinner." Family dinner. She turned the word over. "Marcus and Sophie," she said. "Yes, they've both been asking about you." This may have been true. She had no way of knowing. It might be a good time to reconnect. It's been a while. "It has," she said. "So, you'll come?" She thought about the 9-year-old at the kitchen table, asking if she could come and live with them. She thought about the creak of Earl's bus on winter mornings. She thought about Rose's hands, her warm hands, and the talcum powder smell. She thought about the cream blazer and the way Patricia's voice had landed in that airport bathroom, carrying the full weight of the world it described. She thought about Gerald Park saying, "I look closely." She thought about Delia and the midnight table and the notebook and all the years of keeping records no one asked her to keep. "I'll come," she said, because she was not a person who let grief make her decisions. Because Rose would not have wanted her to be. Because there was a difference between letting people back in and erasing what had been done. And Miriam had learned to hold both things at once. The restaurant Thomas had chosen was the kind of place that had no prices on the menu for some of the guests, and where the lighting was designed to make everyone look slightly better than they were. Miriam wore the navy blazer and her grandmother's pearl earrings, and she arrived exactly on time. They were already there. Thomas had aged handsomely in the particular way of men who have access to good medical care. Vivienne was still elegant, her hair done in a way that looked effortless and was not. Marcus was 30 now, with his father's build and an air of pleasant vagueness, the kind that comes from never having needed to be entirely certain of anything. Sophie was 28 and sharp-eyed, and when she looked at Miriam, she looked with something that might have been genuine curiosity. "You look wonderful," Vivian said, which was not untrue. They sat, they ordered. The conversation moved through the familiar territories: Marcus's work in finance, Sophie's consulting career, the Connecticut house, a recent vacation. Miriam listened and answered when asked, and watched the table with the same attention she had always brought to rooms she was moving through. And then, perhaps 40 minutes in, Thomas said it. He said it casually in the middle of a conversational lull, with his wineglass in one hand and the ease of someone sliding a key into a lock. "I heard a rumor at the club," he said. "Someone mentioned a new director of operations at Park Logistics. Said she came out of, and this is what surprised me, said she came right out of airport operations, frontline work apparently. Gerald Park's a good judge, everyone says so, but it struck me as—" He stopped. He had looked up from his wineglass. He was looking at her. Something had shifted in his face. Miriam met his eyes. "That's me," she said. The table was quiet. Sophie made a sound that might have been a laugh caught mid-breath. Marcus looked up from his phone. Thomas set his wineglass down. The movement was careful, the way you put something down when your hands are not entirely steady. "You're the new director," he said. "Yes." "At Park Logistics." "Yes." He nodded. He nodded several times, slowly, the way people nod when they need time. Vivian was looking at him, and then at Miriam, with the expression of someone recalibrating. It was Sophie who spoke. Sophie, who Miriam had met exactly twice before tonight, who was 28 years old and apparently had not inherited the family gift for emotional management, said plainly, "That's incredible. How long have you been working toward that?" "My whole life," Miriam said, "without knowing it. And then, very specifically, for the last 6 years. And you never told us," Thomas said. "It was not an accusation. It was something else. Recognition, maybe, of a specific thing he had earned. You never asked," she said, simply, without heat. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it the way you watch something change shape. He was not a bad man. She had made her peace with that complexity years ago. He was a man who had made a choice about his child and his comfort, and had kept the choice intact for 40 years. And now he was sitting across a restaurant table from the evidence of everything that choice had not accounted for. "I owe you a conversation," he said finally. "You do," she agreed. "More than one." "Probably," she said. "But I'm here right now, and so are you. That's something." Sophie was looking between them with the focused attention of someone witnessing something significant and knowing it. Marcus had put his phone fully in his pocket, which Miriam noted, which cost her a small private smile. What followed was not a dramatic scene of reckoning. There were no tears at the table, no confessions that rolled out like a wave breaking. Life is rarely like that. What happened was smaller and more real. Thomas began, haltingly, to talk about the decision they had made when she was 4 years old, not justifying it, but describing it. And Miriam listened with the same attention she gave to everything, and she asked the questions she needed to ask, and he answered them not smoothly, not the way he had answered everything for 40 years, but with the specific imperfection of someone finally putting down a thing they have been carrying. It took 3 hours. They were the last table in the restaurant. The waiter refilled their water glasses 4 times without comment, which Miriam appreciated. She drove home alone. She sat in her car outside her apartment building for a little while, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she wanted to give the evening its proper weight before she carried it inside. She thought about Rose. She thought about what Rose would have made of tonight. The restaurant, the blazer, Thomas's face when he understood. She thought Rose would have felt something complicated and true, the way Rose felt everything. She thought Rose would have said, "You handled that well, baby." And then probably, "Now come in and have some tea, it's cold." The work was challenging and real, and sometimes grueling in the best way, the way of things that matter. Gerald Park was direct and demanding and fair. He had opinions about her work, and he expressed them, and he was interested in her opinions about his decisions in return. The team was skeptical at first, the way teams always are, and Miriam spent her first 4 months doing the thing she had always done, which was learning every name, every role, every process inefficiency, and every informal workaround, and then beginning, quietly, to make things better. Now stop right here for a moment, because if you've come this far with Miriam, if you've felt every piece of this story in your chest the way it was meant to be felt, then you know someone who needs to hear it. Share this video with her. She might be the one working the job that doesn't show what she's really worth. She might be the one who was given to someone else to raise and has spent her whole life wondering what that means about her. Share it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do it now, because there is a new story here every single week. Stories like this one, about the people the world forgot to watch. 8 months into the role, Miriam was asked to fly to a conference in Atlanta, her first in this new chapter, in this new life. She packed carefully. She wore the navy blazer. She sat in the business class seat, which still felt strange and right at the same time, and she thought about the 10,000 times she had walked past those seats pushing her cleaning cart, past the people in them who looked through her, and she thought, the world is very large. It contains multitudes. I contain multitudes. The conference was 2 days of panels and workshops and the particular social ecosystem of professional gatherings, where everyone is performing slightly and the real conversations happen in hallways and at dinner tables and in elevators between floors. Miriam was good at conferences. She had the quality of genuine attention, which people feel and which they seek out. And she found herself in interesting conversations with people she would not have met any other way. On the second afternoon, she was in the hotel lobby waiting for a colleague when she heard the heels, sharp, expensive, announcing themselves before their owner arrived, and then she saw her, Patricia. The cream blazer had been replaced by a charcoal one, but the bearing was the same, the absolute assurance of someone who has rarely been surprised. She was with a group of 3 others, all in the same register of polished ease, moving toward the conference registration table. Patricia glanced at the lobby as she moved through it. Her eyes passed over Miriam. They passed over her the way eyes pass over furniture, and then something caught. A hesitation. The way you hesitate when something almost recognized tugs at the edge of your attention. Their eyes met. Patricia looked at the badge on Miriam's lapel, the conference badge, name and title and organization. She looked at the blazer, at the pearl earrings, at the way Miriam was standing. Miriam watched her read it, watched the calculations, watched the reconfiguring. She did not smile. She did not make a gesture of triumph. She held Patricia's gaze for a moment with the calm, level look that Rose had given the world for 82 years, that Earl had given the road ahead from the driver's seat of his bus, that had been growing in Miriam since she was 4 years old, on a doorstep with 2 garbage bags and eyes that had already learned not to expect too much. Then she looked away. Her colleague arrived. She shook hands, greeted him warmly, and they moved together toward the afternoon session. She did not look back. There is a thing Rose used to say that Miriam has repeated to herself in the hard moments and the triumphant ones, in the airport corridors and the conference rooms and the long, quiet evenings after big days. Dignity is not something anyone can give you, baby, and it is not something anyone can take. It's the thing you carry with you everywhere, and the only question is whether you remember you have it. Miriam always remembered. She is 44 years old. She works in a glass-walled office now, with a view of a skyline and a desk that she fills with organized chaos and the particular focused energy of someone who is exactly where she was always trying to get to. She has the photograph of Rose and Earl on the corner of her desk, young and laughing on the yellow house steps. She has her grandmother's pearl earrings in her ears most days. She has Delia's number at the top of her contacts, and the certainty of that friendship as a kind of bedrock. She has a relationship with Thomas and Vivian that is honest and limited and real in a way their earlier relationship never was. They meet for dinner 2 or 3 times a year, and the conversations are careful and genuine. And she has made her peace with the fact that peace is what she wanted, not vindication. Vindication is cold. Peace is something you can actually live in. She thinks about Rose every day, not always with sadness, mostly with the specific warmth of someone who has been truly loved and knows it. She thinks about how much Rose would have enjoyed the view from the office window, the way the light changes in the late afternoon. She thinks Rose would have had opinions about the office plants. She always had opinions about plants, and would have wanted more of them, and would have been right. She thinks sometimes about the 9-year-old who asked to come home and was redirected. She thinks about her with tremendous tenderness and without self-pity, the way you think about someone you once were who survived something difficult and came out strange and strong in themselves. She would like, if she could, to go back and sit with that 9-year-old in Earl's armchair and say, I know it doesn't make sense. I know you deserve different, but look what is going to come from this. Look at the garden you're going to grow in the place where it wasn't supposed to grow. She thinks about things that look like deprivation and turn out to be formation. She thinks about Earl's whistled songs and their particular wisdom, not the wisdom of certainty, but of continuity, of showing up every day and doing the thing and trusting that the road goes somewhere even when you can't see the destination. She thinks about the notebooks, all the notebooks, filled with observations no one asked for that turned out to be exactly the thing someone needed. She thinks about the bathroom at gate 14. She does not think about it with anger. She thinks about it the way you think about rain. It came, it passed, it had nothing to do with who you are. Some people just never managed to do better. She managed, not in the way Patricia meant, not to prove a point, not to plant a flag or collect a victory. She managed in the way her grandmother and grandfather had managed, which is the best way, by deciding very quietly every single day that the world's assessment of her was not the final word. That she was the one keeping the final record, that the notebook was hers. There is a kind of justice that is not loud and not spectacular, and does not deliver itself in the form of a confrontation or a speech. It is the justice of a life lived with full attention, of a person who was told in 100 small and large ways that she was not quite enough, not quite right, not quite the right fit for this chapter, and who built her chapter anyway, from scratch, from savings and certifications and late nights and the love of 2 ordinary people who chose her and meant it. Rose's garden in the yellow house was not a grand thing. It was a modest backyard, some beds of vegetables, some flowers, things that needed tending. Earl had built the beds from lumber he'd gotten from a neighbor's renovation scraps. Rose had planted carefully, knowing what each thing needed, not planting things in the wrong season, not forcing bloom before the ground was ready. She had kept the garden going for over 40 years. When Miriam helped in the garden as a child, Rose would say, "Everything has its time. You can't rush a thing into its time, but you can make sure the ground is good." The ground is good. That is what Miriam carries, not the years of being overlooked, not the bathroom at gate 14, not the phone call about the house or the Christmas visits that felt like audits, or the non-answer at 9 years old. She carries the ground. She carries Rose's hands and Earl's whistle and the yellow house in October, with the light coming through the kitchen window. She carries the midnight table and Delia's voice and Gerald Park saying, "I look closely." She carries all the notebooks. She carries the pearl earrings, which are small and real and exactly right. She carries dignity, the kind that cannot be given or taken, the kind that just needs to be remembered. And she remembers. Every day she remembers. If you felt Miriam's story in the deepest part of you, if you have ever been the one who was underestimated, or left in someone else's care, or told that you were not quite the right fit for this chapter, then this story was made for you. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. because there is a new story here every single week. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things with what they were given. Stories that will remind you, in the specific way that only real human lives can, that the ground can be good, that everything has its time, that the world's assessment of you is never the final word. You are the one keeping the final record. Don't forget it.